Guinea Pig, PH.D. by Alfred. This story from one of the Golden Age gods of science fiction was only ever published in the March 1940 issue of Startling Stories magazine. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. Guinea Pig, PH.D. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Psychology 102A, Tuesday and Thursday afternoons from 2 to 5. It is a course designed to supplement your advanced work in physiology and will consist of 2 lectures and 4 lab hours per week. Permit me to introduce myself. My name is Winter, W-I-N-T-E-R. Write it down in your notebooks if you can't remember. Since I am only an assistant professor, you cannot call me Prof, but in view of a trifling thesis I wrote last year, you may properly call me Doctor. Probably some of you will refer to me by other names before the semester is over. Thank you, but let me remind the class that although I am young, I am not gullible. 4 or 5 years ago, I too was trying to laugh my way into an A, and I remember all the tricks. This is a snap course, ladies and gentlemen. You'll have to do more than laugh at my weak jokes. You are intrigued, I hope, with the beautiful display of apparatus and creatures on the lecture table. These are the tools with which we shall work. We are engaged in investigating the capacity for learning in the lower forms of life. Now, as an introduction to our course, let me give you a preliminary outline of what we shall do. There are certain life forms that are able to modify inborn conduct to prevailing circumstances. The spider and the bird are excellent examples. The spider builds his web according to an instinctive formula. Each species spins its own particular type web, but the minor details depend on just where the spider happens to begin construction. The insect will modify its plan to suit the site. Birds, too, build their nests according to a plan characteristic of the particular species. Here again, you will find that not only does the bird modify the nest according to the site, but to the materials at hand as well. Now, many people attribute such phenomena to the thinking powers of the creatures. This is merely optimistic idealism. Don't fear the ant's intelligence. He will never conquer the world. These operations, which seem to be intelligent, that is, thought out, are derived solely from instinct. The variations which we observe are merely the plasticity and flexibility of set, inborn instincts. We shall continue with our research to learn that some animals exhibit the phenomenon of memory, but this is not at all amazing. Memory is no sign of intelligence. In fact, it may even be exhibited by colloids. Don't wriggle in your seats, it's quite true. The manner in which a colloid has been created governs its future reactions to reagents. This is no more nor less than memory. Now, protoplasm is essentially colloidal in composition, and consequently it too exhibits memory. This glass tube, shaped like a Y with a very long stem, is a testing chamber for earthworms. The subject crawls along until it reaches the fork. If it turns to the right, well and good. If it turns to the left, it receives a mild shock from the wire attached. After a few hundred attempts, the rather stupid worm learns to keep to the right. The worm learns, you cry. Not so, for if we excise the minute brain, we discover that the organism, now no more than a mass of protoplasm, still keeps to the right. In fact, you may excise beforehand, and the brainless mass will still learn to keep to the right. Now, fiction writers to the contrary notwithstanding, we have little to fear from the animals. Their learning capacity is far behind ours. We, from one isolated experience, can deduce either a series of answers or a general hypothesis. The animal cannot. We can comprehend, itemize, and classify. The animal cannot. Here, for example, is a tank of crayfish. Ostensibly, to them it is a natural and happy home. To us, of course, it is merely a reservoir of experimental subjects. Presently I shall remove one of these crustaceans for an experiment. Not only will the remainder fail to notice the loss, they will even fail to observe the intrusion of the tongs. In other words, the lower forms cannot recognize a phenomenon from its secondary manifestations, as can the human. They must have such matter thrust directly upon them for awareness. Roiled waters mean nothing to them. They must have the metal smite them on the head. I seem to have mislaid those much talked of tongs. Ah, here they are. And now, before I dip into the tank for our first experimental subject, may I leave with you an idea that will bear much contemplation? There are many of us, ladies and gentlemen, who differ not at all from the crayfish. These are the people who will not be cognizant of the thunderstorm until they are struck by lightning. The students roared again as I turned. It was a good class, I thought, and would probably turn out well. Their laughter sounded quite sincere, and I knew that despite my assumed dry curtness, we would get along through the semester. There is nothing more encouraging to a young instructor than good-humored students, and those chuckles had a very satisfactory ring to my ears as I reached to pick up the tongs. Then the sound abruptly ceased. There was a split-second rush of kaleidoscopic colors before my eyes. My heart suddenly began knocking against my ribs as I realized that something was terribly wrong. I still stood, feet firmly planted to the ground, one hand outstretched, but around me whirled the maddest, most fantastic riot of insanity that I had ever seen. The lecture amphitheater, the familiar sights and sounds of Harrison Laboratory, the dull murmur from the streets, all had disappeared. In some strange fashion, I had been transferred, in the barest fraction of a second, from reality to chaos. I lowered my arms slowly, and then, thinking that perhaps my eyes had betrayed me, called out loudly, hoping to hear the surprised answers of the students who should have been seated behind me. My voice sounded flat and dead, as though I were shouting in a room with padded walls. I sucked in my breath and screamed once again, screamed until my throat ached. Only dead, unearthly silence answered. I could feel my chest heave with nervousness and fright. I realized that my fingernails were biting into the palms. I was trembling. And the madness of those colors! They swirled and danced before me like an idiot dancing in the wind. They bowed and nodded, heaved and contracted like some great flame whipped by a hurricane. There was nothing but color all around me, above, below, on all sides, and it seemed alive. It writhed and gesticulated with life. My stomach heaved. It was the same sensation I had when a swiftly moving elevator slowed abruptly, and I realized I must have been traveling through the weird space at breakneck speed. I hung poised then. I could sense the pause, the loss of motion, and still there was nothing but that evil dance of spangled darting color around me. It curled and eddied like gusts of smoke in a draughty room. Then a great white tendril approached with the rush of an express train. It pushed up through the curling, vivid splashes. It was followed by another. Swiftly but gently, they curved themselves around my waist and held me in a firm, almost crushing grip. I was too frightened to wriggle. I sagged against the hard, dead white and noted absently that it was metallic. It glistened with a strange luster. There was a soundless rush of the dancing mists, and I was conscious of a swift flight toward a distant speck that loomed toward me. It was bright blue, and as it grew, I could see many sparkling facets glisten from the nucleus toward a rim that spread before my eyes until it was lost far in the distance on either side. The speck burgeoned to a great disk, and at last to an infinite-reaching wall as I lost sight of the edges. And then there was the heave in my stomach again as my motion halted, and I was conscious of a dreadful scrutiny. It came over me then, suddenly, that I was being inspected by that great eye. I remembered, for some strange reason, the way we in the laboratory used to select an experimental subject and examine it closely for possible injuries before setting it to work. I hung in the air, grasped by those two white cables, and felt that the wall of blue was probing into my very soul. I tried to collect my thoughts. I had been lecturing to my class, and in the smallest fraction of a second, I had been transported to a chaos of colors. It seemed almost as though I had gone stark mad and was seeing the normal world with the eyes of a maniac. I peered intently at the great blue disk and then at the swirling clouds of colors behind me. I could sense great, huge forms drifting majestically about, moving so slowly that they gave me a premonition of foreboding. I wondered if what I saw was merely a secondary manifestation of some enormous super being almost beyond the ken of my senses, some super scientist who was using me for his guinea pig, earthworm. My head snapped up and I was tense with the first reasonable clue. The idea seemed fantastic, much too ironic to be plausible. And yet, I could not help but see the ridiculous parallel between my experience and that of the poor little subjects with which I had worked in my laboratory. The rushing motion began again. The blue disk dwindled, receded, and vanished. I was whirled through the twisting colored vapors, and then I noticed that my skin was beginning to parch and burn with an intolerable rasp. It seemed as though I were rapidly evaporating, as though something were being sucked out of my body. I rubbed and chafed at my hands and face, trying to ease the agonizing burns. And then, as I brought my fingers close to my eyes, I saw they were silted with a faint red mud. The motion ceased, and with an abrupt jolt, the white cables, or were they super fingers, loosened their hold, and I dropped a few inches to my feet. Suddenly I became sick with terror, sick with the fear that I was standing in an unknown space on the brink of some infinite abyss, sick with the loneliness of a man with no familiar thing by which to orient himself, nothing but the living colored mist that was slowly sucking my life away. I took a timid step, feeling with my foot like a blind man groping for an invisible stair. There was solidity before me. I took another step, and then a third. Where my support came from in that never-ceasing, pulsating mist, I could not tell. I only knew that I was on something firm. In a few seconds I was walking slowly. Presently I was sauntering, and then I began a brisk march that took me, as far as I could tell, to nowhere in particular. There was absolutely no perspective, no depth, no dimensions. It was impossible for me to focus my eyes on anything. The mist took on more vigorous life as I increased my pace. I felt like a swimmer trying to walk under water, and I could not tell whether the resistance had increased or I had weakened, for my skin was plastered now with carmine, and it tasted salt on my lips. It looked like clotted corpuscles after blood had been centrifuged, and I brought up in a frightened halt. Corpuscles oozing, extruding through the skin. I looked around wildly. Osmotic pressure? Some peculiar property of this superspace atmosphere? Then I noticed a break in the color curtain. For the first time I was able to fix my eyes on something, although it seemed to be more than a faint, steady patch of gray behind the vapors. I quickened my pace until I was running toward it, running down a long corridor of brilliance toward what seemed to be the mouth of a tunnel. Escape was before me. As I approached, it opened out into a large crystal chamber, and I made a feverish dash to enter. Then, just as my foot crossed the threshold and I took my first step into the clear room, my frame was racked by a violent, grating vibration that ground my teeth together. A cacophony of ear-splitting thunders burst over my head. I tottered dizzily and shut my eyes. I was violently sick. I felt a jolt in my waist and saw the two white cables fastened around me. There was a breathless flight through flickering space, and once more I was lowered and jarred to my feet. Then I paused and took stock. So it was an experiment, after all. I, Simon Winter, experimental psychologist, was playing the part of a subject for some super psychologists. I had to grin, despite the mist that was eating at my skin, despite the fear of what was to follow. It was the cream of the jest that the experimenter should become the experimentee. But what was the test? My legs were weakening. I staggered, and before I realized it, I had begun walking again. I hiked along like a man under a spell, watching the colored atmosphere and trying to figure out the experiment. I had an inkling, but I wanted to be certain. I waited until the small patch of gray appeared once more, ran to it, and darted over the door rim. It was the same great crystal chamber, but this time there were no shuddering vibrations, no sickening nausea and roaring noises. I knew then that the cables would come down for me again, as they had before, and once more carry me off in swift flight. I knew then what the experiment was, a superspace Y tube. I was the earthworm. Keep to the right, no shock. Take the left turn and sickness and nausea. But what was the difference? Which was right and which left? This was space as I had never seen it before. I could not get my bearings, and the silt on my skin. And then began the long series of journeys. I knew what the problem was, there was no doubt about that. I understood what the experimenters wanted me to do, but there was a missing factor. As I ran and ran for seeming endless hours and stumbled alternately into one or the other of the two chambers, I realized that the solution was beyond my comprehension. There was that missing factor of space. I could not reason out their dimensions. So long as that was impossible, I would never solve the mystery of the why. Then I realized that that was the problem. That was the crux of the experiment, and I was failing miserably. The red on my skin was thickening to a mud, and suddenly I was overcome with hysteria. I began running madly in vain efforts to pound my way out of the experiment, and the horrible series of run, shock, run continued. Every so often, I would somehow stumble in the right direction for a brief respite, only to be picked up and started off on another wild, groping tour. The torture of the vibrating thunder was unendurable insanity, and I began to think I was going out of my mind. Then I noticed I was entering the right chamber more often. I was in a hopeless state of bewilderment by then, knowing only that I was to run each time the blanket of dancing colors smothered me. I was to run and run, hoping I would take the right unknown direction. I could not be certain of any particular path, for there were no landmarks as we knew them in our space to use as guides, but the shocks grew more infrequent until at last I was dashing blindly into the right room at each successive try. There was no doubt about the relief of that. The white cables returned me again, and each time my body led me blindly and accurately in the right direction. At last the cables swept me up and held me for a time in a colorless, pearly mist. But there was no relief in that. For suddenly I remembered what we did to earthworms when at last they had learned the secret of their little glass tubes. I struggled feverishly in the grasp of the glittering metal. I knew that I had not learned. I knew that only my body, conditioned by the enervating shocks, had learned its painful lesson, and I had the desperate knowledge that these great experimenters were about to prove it. Excision? No, perhaps not that, but at least something to destroy the brain. I was conscious of the gigantic dim shapes moving about me as I pounded and beat at the white cables, the white fingers, perhaps. I wanted to bite and scratch at them like a snarling, snapping rat. The opalescence was clouded by a magenta mist that drifted cone-shaped toward me as though it had been blown from the nozzle. It choked and filled my lungs with a ghastly sweetness. I was afraid of some anesthetic and held my breath, but it passed and left my skin clear and unsmudged. Evidently, they had bathed me in some antiseptic. Then I twisted my arms around the gigantic fingers that held me and dug for my pockets. As I struggled, I could see traces of another cloud drifting up in blue whirls to envelop my figure, drifting from far in the distance where I could barely see the glimmer of a metal nozzle. I had to make the last attempt to bite before the cloud arrived, for I knew it must be the anesthesia. I fumbled desperately for anything, and my hand touched the cool haft of my pocket knife. I withdrew it, snapped open the blade, and placed the tip against the shining white metal of those colossal fingers. The first blue fringes were sweeping over me, and I got a whiff of intoxicating musk. I held my breath, and with open palm hammered at the end of the knife, trying to drive the point in. I pounded until my hand reddened and bruised, until I thought my chest would burst. I hammered until at last the gleaming white gave way suddenly, and the knife blade drove swiftly into the hilt. I was jerked violently in space, far from the deadly blue cloud, until once again I was surrounded by the dancing whirls of that vivid atmosphere. There came to my ears from far overhead a great droning sound, as though the super-psychologist had cried out in pain. Cried out in pain. Certainly that was it. The way I had yelped many a time when an infuriated white rat had turned and nipped my fingers. I looked at the knife. I was still buried in the white tentacle, and an enormous drop of luminescent fluid was oozing from the wound. The thunderous drone vibrated in my ears, and I was dashed violently through space. The sound resolved itself into the hearty laughter of the class, roaring at my quip. My eyes flickered tentatively and then managed to open, and my hand finished its forward progress to hover over the tongs on the shelf. A faint tremor passed across my body, and I felt as though I had just awakened from some chromatic hallucination. I had said that the crayfish tank was really our reservoir of subjects, although ostensibly a happy home to them. Then what about our own Earth? Was our reality a mere specimen jar for super scientists in another space and time? Scientists whose hours of experimentation were so small a fraction of our time that my brothers in the tank were not even aware that I had been removed with cosmic tongs and returned. I picked up my own instrument and returned slowly to the demonstration table. It might have been a momentary hallucination, I reflected, a weird distortion of my own experiences, especially that bit about flinging the subject back into the tank. How many times I'd done that in fury after a crayfish had scissored my fingers. But I was frightened, for the knife was not in my pocket when I felt hopefully, and I knew it had been there. It was probably being plucked out by an enraged experimenter somewhere in another space, an infuriated man who might be staunching the luminescent blood with a colossal piece of tape. And I was still in the tank. He would remember that I had been used before, might want to continue the experiment that had been interrupted. For how long? Trembling and trying not to show it, I faced the class. "But remember this, ladies and gentlemen," I continued. "We must not be too smug. The behavior of humans may be no more than a similar elasticity of instincts. For all we know, we may be as rigorously bound to instinctive behavior as the birds and insects. Our capacity for thought, of which we boast so much, may be nothing more than this on a broader plane. So don't feel too superior when we experiment on the stupid earthworm, for there may be some colossal student of colossal psychology waiting to experiment with you. Remember, humility is a necessary ingredient for every scientist and for every human being.